I want to acknowledge my advisors and co-authors, Dr. Chris Tanra, Dr. Steve Matthews, and Dr. Leela Pinchot, who a lot of this research has been developed with them. All right, let's see. Okay, so I'm going to begin with some background on oak trees. So oaks are a really important foundational species, especially in the Appalachians in southern Ohio. They are, they really support a lot of Lepidoptera larvae. So that's moth and butterfly larvae, and well over 500 species. And this in turn supports a huge number of songbird species that feed off of those larvae, particularly migrant songbirds. So pictured here is a Cerulean Warbler, which if any of you are birders out there in the audience, migration is in full swing right now. So you might see some of these guys out there. And they really depend on oaks for nesting habitat and foraging habitat. But of course, oaks are famous for the acorns that they produce. So just the acorns themselves also support well over 90 species of wildlife that feed on those acorns, including some really popular game species like turkeys, wood ducks, and deer. But one question about oaks is why they would produce these acorns that are so valuable for wildlife. So acorns are really great food resource for wildlife because they have a lot of protein and fat, so they're really energy rich. So a lot of wildlife like to eat them, but that's not benefiting the oaks in any way because they're just destroying the seed when they eat the acorn. So acorns aren't like berries where the seed, when it passes through the gut, is dispersed. So most of the wildlife species that eat acorns are destroying them. So why would oak trees have developed these acorns? Well, as you probably guessed, the whole point of this is really to attract just a few individual species that disperse those acorns, in particular ones that cache the acorns. So, most famously, there's the squirrel, exemplified here by the squirrel from the Ice Age movies, which spends like the whole trilogy just chasing around one acorn. And so what they do, the squirrels, they'll take the acorn, and then instead of eating it right there, a lot of times they'll cache it. And you see this, every autumn you go out and just look at the gray squirrels in the yard, you'll see them doing this. They're caching acorns. And of course, that's for future winter consumption. So they are intending to eat the acorns. They're not purposely, helping out the oak trees here. But if some of the squirrels forget where the acorns are cached, or if a squirrel dies after it's cached a lot of acorns, all of those acorns that have been cached are then in a good situation to germinate and grow into trees. So the mutualistic relationship here is that the squirrels and other rodents and birds that are caching these nuts have a reliable food source throughout the harsh period of the winter. And then the oak trees gain a great dispersal service for their seeds, where the oaks are able to colonize new areas. But blue jays are actually a more effective seed disperser for many acorns than squirrels are. My cat's already trying to get into the screen. So there's a few reasons I'm going to go through why blue jays are so good at this. But before I do, just some more background on blue jay dispersal here. So one study from the late 80s found that blue jays are probably the reason that oaks were able to expand so rapidly after the last ice age. So speaking of ice age, after the last glaciers retreated about 11 or 12,000 years ago. So looking at the fossil pollen record, scientists have been able to determine that the oak migration rates moving north after the glaciers were retreating was up to 300 meters per year, which is pretty fast for a tree. And blue jays are really the only animal that can explain such a rapid migration. So, one individual bird can cache thousands of nuts in a year. The dispersal distances for those nuts is often thousands of meters, whereas for squirrels and other rodents and many other birds, it's only tens of meters, occasionally over 100 meters or so. And so blue jays, like squirrels, or like some squirrels, they cache their nuts in the ground and not in trees. So, some woodpeckers also cache a lot of nuts, but woodpeckers typically cache those acorns in trees, and so that's not really a great location for the acorn to germinate. So the reason that the blue jays are so good at this, so one, of course, they have wings, so they can fly, and it's much easier for them to take the acorns long distances. But they're also, the way that they cache nuts is really beneficial. So they're scatter hoarders and not larder hoarders. So this photo on the right here is showing an example of a larder cache, where basically the squirrel has brought all of the acorns just to one location, and then it guards that location throughout the winter and returns to that spot to eat the acorns. So, red squirrels do this, woodpeckers do this, but blue jays and also gray squirrels do this as well. Blue jays are scatter hoarders. So instead of just having one cache with all their acorns, pretty much every time they go to cache an acorn, they take it to a new spot. So they're getting 1 or 2 or 3 acorns in their bill, they're flying to a spot, caching, and they're going and getting another load of acorns and taking it somewhere else. So that's really great for the oaks in terms of dispersal. So they can take these acorns, across large areas of unsuitable habitat. So this figure here is kind of showing how blue jays can disperse to new habitats. So they can find new habitats that have not been colonized by oaks yet and help colonize those. And so they're really, through the scatter hoarding behavior, they're really helping oaks disperse across the landscape a lot better than most other species that cache nuts do. So before I get into my research, I want to give a little bit more background on acorn production. So the oak group of species, or the oak genus, has 2 subgroups. So there's red oak group and the white oak group. In Ohio, the red oak group has some common species are black oak, scarlet oak, and northern red oak. And in the white oak group, we have white oak, chestnut oak, and bur oak are some of the common species. But there are some key differences in these 2 groups of oaks. So in the red oaks, they take 2 years to mature acorns. So that means that from the time the flower is pollinated in the spring, it takes the acorn 1 full year and then to the next fall before that acorn is produced from the pollination event. So basically, if flowers are pollinated this spring, the acorns produced from that pollination will not mature and drop until fall of 2022. Whereas the white oak group only takes 1 year to mature acorns. So acorns pollinated this spring will mature and fall this coming fall. Red oaks also, acorns also have a dormancy period. So they are dormant during the winter and they don't start germinating until the following spring after they've dropped. White oaks do not have a dormancy period. So as soon as they drop onto the ground, they pretty much start putting out that germination radicle. That photo below here kind of shows all of these white oak acorns that put out these long tap roots, or the beginnings of tap roots here. And this photo is from, I believe, December. And so I collected these acorns in October and they've already started to grow these tap roots. Whereas the black oaks in this other photo have not, they're dormant until the spring. So nutrition-wise, there's also some differences. Red oaks have more tannins. That makes them more bitter. And it also means that the protein in the acorn is not as accessible. So tannins are this chemical that binds to proteins and makes it less digestible. So white oaks have fewer of those and they're sweeter and more palatable. But red oaks, on the other hand, also have more fat versus white oaks. So there's some trade-offs there in nutrition between these 2 groups. The other really important thing about acorn production in oaks is they have these mastine cycles. So mastine is another word for acorn production, basically. So I'll kind of be using mastine interchangeably with acorn abundance and production. throughout the talk. But so basically, acorn production is not uniform across years. It's not a just reliable average production rate every year. So it bounces all over the place. So this figure is kind of showing, this is from Ohio Division of Wildlife acorn surveys for the last 15 years. And on the y-axis here, we have that percent of trees that are bearing acorns going across time here. And so if we look at the red line, that's showing the average acorn production for red oaks across the wildlife areas that were surveyed. And the green line is the white oak group. And the horizontal lines show the long-term averages of production. So you can kind of see here that we have some years that have well above average production, and then they drop very low and then up high, and then we kind of bouncing back and forth here. And you have very few years that have just an average amount of production. Another thing to notice on this figure is that sometimes the two groups match up their acorn production. So if we look at this period between 2009 and 2015, the red oak group and the white oak group seems to really be masting in the same way. So they're kind of following each other. But then before that, the beginning of the graph and here at the end in the last 2 years, they were sort of doing an opposite pattern where, red oaks were having a high production, whereas white oaks were having a low production. So the point is, it's very variable, and it's not always that red oaks and white oaks are on opposite years here. Now, the really interesting thing about this acorn production and these masting cycles is that it's synchronized across such a huge area. So over many hundreds of miles, the oaks in that area pretty much have the same mast abundance or the same acorn abundance. And this is a really, curious behavior of the trees that is not really fully understood yet. So there's a lot of ideas about how the trees might synchronize this, but we still don't have a great understanding of exactly how it's done. So some of the things that go into it are resource dynamics. So, looking at this figure here in the middle, it's kind of showing some of these dynamics. So down at the bottom in the root layer, you might have different amounts of nitrogen or phosphorus or potassium, depending on the year. There'd be different pollination dynamics happening in the spring. A lot of that could be based on weather and when you have good pollination conditions. But a lot of it probably, especially the synchronization, comes down to genes and hormones. And it's thought that there are certain cues in the weather that trigger a hormonal response in the tree to put out a big bloom of flowers or to not do that. So since weather cues are kind of the main thing that are felt over a very large area, so resource dynamics and pollination dynamics might happen over small areas, but with all the environmental variation, it's hard to have those explain the synchronization as well. So there's probably some combination of cues from the weather and a hormonal response that the trees are able to synchronize this masting. Now, the other question is, why would trees evolve this behavior, this synchronized masting behavior? And there are a couple of theories that seem to have some evidence in the research to support. So the first one is that it really increases the pollination efficiency. So if you think about one tree that you have one oak tree in your backyard that puts out a lot of flowers, but none of the other trees around it have done that at that time, then the cross-pollination rate is going to be very low. So it ends up being more beneficial and more energy efficient to have all of the trees produce a big bloom at once. So you put a lot of energy into one big bloom, and then you really increase the efficiency of cross-pollination, and then you don't have to put that energy into it next year or something like that. So the other theory here is called the predator satiation hypothesis. And what this has a little bit less actual evidentiary support in the research, but it's still thought to probably be driving the evolution of this. So what this is saying is that the change in abundance of acorns kind of regulates the acorn predator communities. So this can be both for the animals that are eating and caching the acorns, but also for insects and weevils that are infesting the acorns. So, you know, if you think about on a very low acorn production year, probably a lot of those acorns are going to be infested by weevils because there's not very many on the tree, and so it'll be really easy for the weevils to get to all of them. So in those low acorn production years, you're going to have very few acorns that survive to germinate into new trees. However, the low production year also means that the weevil population won't be able to grow that much because there's not a huge food source. But then if you then hit them the next year with an overabundance of acorns, there's going to be many more acorns that the weevils can get to. So you're kind of flooding the market with acorns. So the proportion of acorns that escapes predation is much higher. And the same goes for caching populations. So you're kind of flooding the market with more acorns than the animals need. And so that encourages over storage of acorns. So the birds and the squirrels are going to be storing more acorns than they need just because there's so many around. So that's one of the ideas of why this behavior has evolved. So these fluctuating acorn production cycles have a really, multitude of cascading effects on the ecosystem. So this figure on the right is showing some of these effects and all of the intricacies involved. So if you think about, on the left here, we have a mast failure or a very low mast year. So that, since there are a lot of mice that really depend on acorns, that's going to cause the mouse population to go down because there's not as much food to raise young. And the same can be said for the deer population. That will also, so the larval ticks feed on mice. So that means that the tick population will also go down in response to that low acorn year. And as a result, Lyme disease the following year will be at a lower rate. However, the lower mouse population is actually, the mice and other rodents, the lower rodent population is a good thing for small ground nesting birds because those rodents are a main predator of bird eggs. So this will actually be a good thing for ground nesting birds, and they'll be able to produce more young. And the same can be said though for gypsy moths and having moth outbreaks. So mice are one of the main predators of moth larvae in the soil. And so when the mice population goes down, that might encourage that might see a bigger moth outbreak the following year. And then all of the converse, of course, is true in a very good mast year. So you have bigger mice and deer populations, that leads to bigger tick populations, and then the following year, uptick in Lyme disease, but it's also a worse year for moth and bird populations. And an important thing to remember here is that there are time lags involved in the effects of these acorn productions. So one good example of that is the Lyme disease cycle. So an acorn production year, so if you have a very high acorn production year, that doesn't mean that the following spring you'll have high Lyme disease because of the time that it takes in the tick life cycle to feed on mice and then going to feed on deer and then becoming old enough to transmit Lyme disease. It actually means that 2 springs and 2 summers following the high mast year is when you get a high Lyme disease year. So that's a really important thing to remember, that there are time lags involved in some of these interactions. All right, and now there are 2 processes of forest change that are occurring in the Appalachians that I'm concerned with my research. So I'm going to introduce those hopefully quickly, and then I'll really get into my research. All right, so the first one is the ongoing decline of oaks. So part of this is in response to invasive pests like gypsy moths and diseases like oak wilt and oak decline. But one of the biggest issues here is something that's called mesophication. And if you've watched any of the recent webinars, I think a couple of people have talked about this and maybe even seen this figure before, but I'll just quickly go through this. So mesification is the process of a change in the forest from a oak-dominated, shade-intolerant trees to a more maple-dominated, shade-tolerant trees. And the way that this has happened is through a long period of fire suppression. So oaks are a fire-adapted species. And before 1900, there was a fire regime where fires were a natural part of the landscape, and they would kind of clear out the understory and increase and have a more open canopy. So there's more light getting into the understory layer, which was good for oaks, which are not that tolerant of shade. But over time, with the implementation of fire suppression policies in the early 19th and early 20th to mid 20th century, where fires were always being suppressed, that encouraged the canopy to close because there wasn't as much fire clearing out the understory. And that changes the microclimate in the understory layer to more shade and cool and humid. And so that encourages growth for shade tolerant species like maple. It also means that when fires do start, they don't spread as much because the microclimate has changed. It's not as it's not as beneficial for fire to spread. So basically that means that when the current oaks that are old and in the canopy, when they die off, they're going to be replaced by maple and beech and other shade tolerant trees. So over time, the oak dominated canopy will become more dominated by maple. So the other process of forest change has actually not occurred yet. It's an imminent potential change, is the reintroduction of American chestnut. So just a little brief history on American chestnut. It was once a canopy dominant species throughout the Appalachians. So on the figure on the right, you can see the natural range of the American chestnut pretty much follows the Appalachians there. And it was a really important species for wildlife, but also for humans. So a lot of Appalachian communities collected chestnuts and kind of made their income that way by selling them for human consumption, but also for livestock consumption. But of course, in the early 20th century, a introduced fungus caused this chestnut blight disease, which basically killed all or nearly all of the mature chestnuts. And we lost over 4 billion chestnut trees in a few decades. So chestnuts now are still on the landscape, but they only exist as saplings. And once they reach a certain age, the blight begins to infect them, and it usually kills them before they're old enough to produce seeds and produce chestnuts. But in the last 30 or 40 years, there's been a lot of effort to produce families of chestnut trees that are resistant to the blight. So the American Chestnut Foundation has kind of been leading this effort of hybrid breeding to try and get some blight resistance from Chinese chestnut bred into American chestnut trees. And then also more recently, there's been with the development of gene editing technology to make blight resistance in that way. But we're getting closer to having actual reintroductions begin at some point in the next decade or so. I'm not a member of it, or I'm not involved with that, but it's getting much closer to happening. So those are the two processes of forest change that are relevant to my research here. Oh yeah, just a little bit about chestnut seeds, because they have some key differences from acorns. So one of the main differences is that American chestnuts, unlike oak trees, have a fairly uniform seed production from year to year. So they don't have these synchronized cycles where they have large variations in abundance of seeds. They're fairly reliable year to year. That also made them really important to wildlife in low acorn or low oak mast years before they were died off. Chestnuts also are even sweeter than white oak acorns. They're very sweet and palatable, and they have thinner shells than most acorns, so they're more accessible to wildlife species that maybe don't have strong enough jaws or bills to break into acorns. And they do also, like the red oak group of acorns, have a dormancy period, so they germinate in the spring after they mature. Okay, so now I can get into my research here. The big overarching question is how this mutualism that I talked about between blue jays and oaks and chestnuts can shape the future of Appalachian forests, particularly in Ohio, where I'm carrying out my research. So the two ways that I'm looking at this are through researching the scatter hoarding behavior itself and the different aspects of that, and then also looking at blue jay population changes and survival and seeing how that's related to acorn abundance. So I'm carrying out most of my research at the Vinton Furnace Experimental Forest. So this map is showing Vinton County, and Vinton Furnace is kind of in the center south part of that. And this forest has had a long history of forestry and wildlife management and research, really. And it's really a great kind of representation of Appalachian forests. In particular, if you're a little more familiar with the Appalachian forests, it's representative of the unglaciated Allegheny Plateau part of the Appalachians. I also have a secondary field site on private property where I'm carrying out some of this research also within Vinton County. And so I've been doing 3 years of field research. My main field work is in the fall and the winter when blue jays are caching acorns. So 2020 was the last year of research, but I'm still wrapping up some of that now. All right, so the first part of the scatter hoarding behavior I'll be looking at is their seed selection. So the question here is, what are the seed preferences of blue jays, and are they context dependent? And the context that I'm interested in is acorn abundance, essentially, and seeing how their preference might change depending on what acorns are available or what the background abundance of acorns is at that time. So the way I'm doing this is using 6 feeding platforms that I have set up throughout the forest. So this photo here is showing the feeding platform, and I have 3 cameras mounted on each platform that are motion activated that record any visits to the platform. So I begin by baiting the platforms early in the fall with peanuts, which blue jays love, and a number of other birds love as well. And then once blue jays are coming fairly reliably to the platforms, I then start these seed selection trials where I offer 3 species of nuts, and then the cameras record the order in which all those seeds are removed from the platform, and eventually I get an idea of what the preference is for the blue jays that are visiting the platform. The species that I'm using here are white oak acorns, black oak acorns. So that's white oaks representing the white oak group, black oaks representing the red oak group, and then American chestnuts. And I'm also running these trials 2 times a year. So once early-ish in the season, so in sort of mid-October when birds are still caching acorns, and then also in December when most of the acorns are off the trees and birds are primarily recovering cached acorns. So I'm going to show a couple videos of what these seed selection trials look like. And so this is looking down at the platform here, and already most of these seeds have been taken from this video. So what's left here are the dark seeds are chestnuts, and the lighter ones are, I believe, black oak acorns. So we'll kind of see what these birds do here. So that blue jay just took a chestnut and flew off with it. Now here we have a tufted titmouse. He samples a couple chestnuts, doesn't like them. Finds one he likes, and flies off with it. Another titmouse. Again, he samples a couple chestnuts, and the video ends before he chooses one, but I believe he flew off with one. And yeah, so tufted titmice are a common visitor to my platforms. They do also cache acorns, but they do it on a much kind of like squirrels, they don't take them as far as blue jays. They also don't cache quite as deep, so they cover it with a couple leaves, whereas blue jays tend to bury the acorn a little bit further into the duff layer. Let's next. All right, so I have one more video from this. So this is on the side, and the reason that I want to see this angle here, even though I can't see the seed selection tray itself, is because I want to be able to see the bird's legs, and you'll see why in just a second. So this blue jay is one that I've captured and banded. So I can see, so he takes here I believe that's a white oak acorn. And then here's a blue jay that's not banded. He takes another acorn. So as you can see, the reason that I want to have this angle of the platform is so I can see when the individuals that I've color banded, so I can identify to the individual, I want to see what their preferences are. Okay, so the results that I'm going to be sharing today are really preliminary. I haven't really completed a lot of the actual analyses that I'll be doing to really piece apart all the variables that go into this. But, and I haven't finished going through all the videos yet from this past field season. However, just looking at from the first 2 seasons, I had 590 selection events. So that's every time a blue jay came and took a seed and flew off with it. So even just looking at which seeds were taken, you can kind of get a feeling for what the preference is. So 44% of the selections were black oaks, 35% were chestnuts, and then 21% were white oaks. So that's probably the overall preference there, but the future analysis that I'll do will kind of get at, what time of year does the seed preference change, if it changes, and what other variables might go into that. All right, so now looking at the other part of the scatter hoarding process is looking at the dispersal effectiveness. So the questions here are, where are blue jays caching seeds? So what kind of habitats are they bringing them to? Also, how far are they taking seeds from the platforms? And then are these cache sites, are they beneficial for seedling growth? In particular, are they more beneficial for growth than would be expected by chance? So the way I'm doing this, at first we thought maybe we can just follow blue jays from the tree. So if we see them take an acorn from a tree, fly off with it and chase after it, maybe we can find caches that way. That turned out to be very difficult the first 2 years. But actually this past year we had a fair bit of success with that method. So there are 2 methods here that I used, but the main method that I was using was actually tracking the acorns themselves. So I would offer on the platforms acorns and chestnuts that I put a radio telemetry tag in. So this photo here is kind of showing one of those. I've drilled a hole into the acorn, inserted that small radio telemetry tag and cut the antenna. So there's just a little bit of the antenna sticking out of the nut there. And then I offer those on the platforms. And then when the blue jays come and take those and fly off with them, I can use a radio receiver and antenna to home in on the nut and find the cache. But I also want to determine the fate. So a lot of times they're not caching the nuts, they're just eating them. So that's also important to know, determine are the nuts cached or were they just eaten. And then once I find those caches, I will return to plant viable acorns and chestnuts. So of course, the nuts that I've drilled a hole in are no longer going to grow into trees. So I'll go back to those cache sites, plant nuts at the caches and also at random sites, and then monitor the germination and growth of those seedlings over the coming months. So I'm going to show 2 more videos here of what this looks like. And I'm going to show these videos twice. First, I'll just show them for you to watch, and then I'll show them again and kind of narrate what's going on, because it's kind of a neat little microcosm of some of the seed preference results that we saw. So I'll just play these 2 videos first, and then I'll go play them again and point out some of the details here. Okay, and so this next video takes place pretty much right after that last one. Okay, so I'm gonna go back and play this first video again and just kind of explain what's going on here. So this is usually how my the kind of nut dispersal trial would go. I would put 3 tagged nuts of each species on the platform. So right now there are 3, well, there were originally 3 chestnuts, 3 black oak acorns, and 3 white oak acorns. When this video begins, one of the chestnuts has already been taken. That was taken by a woodpecker earlier. So the blue jays show up, and this first one, he takes a black oak acorn. This next one takes another black oak acorn. He puts it in his crop there and tries to get a second one. So he squeezes a white oak acorn there, kind of decides he doesn't really like it. Then he grabs that chestnut. So he flies off with 2 of those nuts. And then in the next video, so what we have left here is a black oak acorn, 3 white oaks, and 1 chestnut. So this blue jay takes the last black oak acorn. And then that guy tries a white oak, doesn't like it. This other one comes in, takes the last chestnut. And so this guy, all that's left now are the 3 white oak acorns. And instead of flying off with this one, he decides to just eat it or begin eating it on the platform there. And so that's kind of an interesting little anecdotal view of what our seed preference results showed. So they kind of took most of the black oak acorns first, then they went for the chestnuts, and lastly the white oaks. And so after that happened, so after the birds have taken all of those tagged nuts from the platform, I then get out my receiver and the antenna and start homing in on those radio signals. So, they're just giving off a signal. It's not GPS or anything. It's just a pulse signal that an antenna can get me closer to until I find it. And then once I locate the signal, I hopefully can uncover the cache if it's been cached. And keep in mind that when birds are eating these acorns, they're not swallowing them whole. So they're picking the meat out like that bird was doing on the platform. So they're not swallowing the antenna. Once they get to the antenna, they just kind of discard it. And so I'll find the little antenna on the ground. So after I've found those caches, I then return with viable seeds, and I plant 1 seed of each species inside a cage. So I have a cage there to prevent seed predators like chipmunks and mice from getting to the seed, because I want to see what the germination and growth rate is going to be at that site. But I also am interested in the seed predation rate. So I also cache 3 seeds outside of the cage. So I have some idea of how many of these seeds, if they were just natural, not in some experiment, how many would be taken by seed predators. So after I cache those viable seeds, I then return in the spring and summer to measure the growth of the seedling. And then I also do a lot of habitat and vegetation, or I collect information about the surrounding habitat and vegetation. So this photo here is a fisheye lens view of the canopy from the seedling's perspective. So one of the important things for seedling growth is how much light the seedling's getting. So again, just really preliminary results here. The table on the left is showing the fate of most of the tagged nuts that were on the platforms. So this is the fate of all the ones I was able to track down and find. So by species, we can see here for black oak acorns, 17 were cached and 24 were eaten. Chestnut, a pretty similar number, were cached and eaten. And white oaks, actually almost the same number, were cached versus eaten. But you can see here that more were dropped. So they were just less interested in white oak acorns in general. So this is somewhat contrary to what we would expect. So white oaks, since they germinate right away and they're sweeter and more palatable, the expectation is that they would eat more white oak acorns rather than cache them. But it looks like proportion-wise, they actually ate more black oak and chestnut than they cached, and they cached and ate about the same number of white oak acorns. So that's a little bit contrary to what we expected. And then in this figure on the right here, this is showing all of the caches that we found, and this is including caches that in this past season we were able to find by tracking, so the natural cache observation. So by seeing the bird take an acorn from a tree and then chasing after it until we find where it cached the nut. So we have more of those. And you can kind of see that most of the caches were within 150 meters of the origin location. So that's either the platform or the parent tree. But we did have some cache events that were, over 300 and 400 meters. So yeah, they are taking the acorns quite a far distance, certainly further than most squirrels would take it. Some studies have found that blue jays can easily take acorns over 4 or 5 kilometers, but usually that's dependent on the landscape. So if the landscape is really fragmented and there's a lot of inappropriate habitat like farmland around, and they'll take the acorns longer distances until they get to a suitable place to cache the acorns. But in a contiguous forest like my field site, there's no need to fly 2 or 3 kilometers to cache an acorn. So that's what we're seeing there. Okay, and the last sort of big part of my research is looking at blue jay overwinter survival and their populations, and if there's any link to those mast cycles that I talked about earlier. So the questions here, first is the winter survival of blue jays dependent on the fall acorn abundance? And then in a bigger picture, what drives blue jay population fluctuations? So the way I'm doing this, there are 2 ways I'm doing this. First, through a local survival study. So here I'm capturing birds, and you've already seen some of these birds that I captured. I color band them, and then I put a radio transmitter, pretty much the same kind of transmitter as that's inside the acorns, just bigger. And so I put a radio transmitter on them, and then I monitor their survival throughout the winter period, using both handheld radio tracking and also automated telemetry, which I'll talk about in a second. And then over the course of 3 years of this study, there was some annual variation in acorn abundance. So we'll kind of start to get an idea of, was survival in each year dependent on the acorn abundance of that fall. And then the second way I'm looking at this is a bigger, broad-scale population analysis that's using long-term data sets. So automated telemetry is basically the same thing as that hand tracking telemetry that I was doing for the acorns, except that we set up these big towers that have much larger antennas, and they're able to continuously record detections of the bird tags. So I don't have to always be out there tracking by hand. So we have these established towers. I have 2 towers set up at Vinton Furnace Experimental Forest. And the idea with tracking the birds, I'm tracking their movements by hand, but the main question is to confirm their survival at least once every 2 weeks from December 1st to April 1st, so throughout the winter period. And just a note about these towers, if anybody is familiar with this, the Modus wildlife tracking system, this is getting more attention recently because it's been expanding a lot in the last few years. But this is a huge collaboration among, probably hundreds of researchers across the continent, where they're putting up automated towers like the ones that I've put up at Vinton Furnace, and they're part of an array of towers across the continent. So these yellow dots are where all the towers are, and then the little loops are the anticipated antenna detection ranges. So you can see here in southern Ohio, these are my 2 towers, have that approximate range. But the idea, I'm not really using this tower array all that much for my research, since it's kind of a local survival study. But if any of my birds are migrants, it's possible that in the spring, if they leave my field site and they head back north, they might get detected as they fly north. So there's quite a few towers in northern Ohio and also southern Ontario where they could theoretically be detected if they're migrating north. All right, so some results of this survival study. Over the 3 years, I was able to track 86 birds. 39 of those were adults, 47 were young. And by young, I mean they're within the first year of their life. And we did have quite a few mortalities. So 24 birds were found to have died at some point over the course of those 3 winters. But it's really seemed to be dependent on their age. So 20 of those mortalities were young birds, so birds that were in their first winter, and only 4 of those mortalities were adults. So they seem to really, adults are much more cautious and savvy about avoiding predators probably. And we also had 12 departures from the field site. Again, most of these were young birds. So these are either birds probably that were migrants that, for whatever reason, they at some point in the winter felt like they weren't getting enough resources or something and moved on to another site. So that's kind of what we found. And these photos, so normally when you come across I'm homing in on the signal by hand. If you find a dead bird, you usually are just going to see this pile of feathers like this. But one time this past year, I did actually find an antenna inside an owl pellet. So this, on the photo on the right here, you can see the antenna here. This is inside a barred owl pellet. If you look closely, you can also see one of the feet of the bird here, so it's a little gruesome. But yeah, the main predators for blue jays during the winter are hawks, like this sharp-shinned hawk and a Cooper's hawk, red-shouldered hawks, and then occasionally, I guess, from this pellet here, barred owls will get them as well. All right, so the other part of this research, as I mentioned, was the broad-scale population analysis. So I'm using 2 long-term population data sets. One is the breeding bird survey, which has been going on since 1966, and has kind of a uniform protocol that many volunteers sort of take out on each spring and summer. And then the Christmas bird count, which has been going for over 100 years now. And so these 2 surveys happen at different times of year. So one's, of course, during the breeding season, and then the other one is during the winter season. And the idea is to look at how the blue jay populations change on a year-to-year basis. So this figure here is showing an example of this. So this is a blue jay populations in Vermont from just before 1970 up to 2010. And so you can kind of see that even though there's a fairly steady number over a long period of time, it does bounce around a lot every year. So I want to see how these different population changes are impacted by acorn abundance surveys. So, using some of these long-term acorn abundance surveys, such as the ones in Ohio, but also in many other states. So I'm trying to do this in as large an area as possible. So I've collected acorn surveys from state wildlife agencies from around the eastern US, particularly in Appalachian states. So there's variable effort. Some of them have been going since the 1960s or 70s. Some of them only started after 2000. But luckily there is, since 2007, 14 states kind of agreed on a set protocol that they've been doing every year. It's called the Regional Mast Survey. So that was really great to get all at once a big data set from 2007 up to the present for 14 states that have been carrying out these acorn surveys. And so really the point is to try and see if there's any relationship, any correlations between how the acorn abundance fluctuates like this over time and how the blue jay populations fluctuate. And it's important to remember again that there could be a time lag in response to the mast, in response to the mast abundance. So, you know, I might have to look at 1 or 2 or 3 years prior to a year to see if there's correlations with mast abundance. But then there's also, of course, lots of other factors that could go into blue jay population changes. So, you know, we're going to first look at acorn abundance, but then we need to take into account a lot of other things like raptor abundance, so that the main predators. Of course, any weather is going to play a big factor, particularly snow cover and freezing cold days. So we had a lot of birds that died in this past season during that period in January and February, where we had continuous snow cover for a long time in Ohio. So that, of course, makes it harder to find their acorn caches and just other food in general. Also potentially looking at populations of competitors like mice and woodpeckers and things that are eating the same resources as blue jays. And then another big question mark is migration and how that plays into these long-term population counts. So there's very little known about blue jay migration really, except that we know that sometimes it happens and sometimes it doesn't. So, you know, there are plenty of blue jays that are just resident in the area year-round, like cardinals. They don't move all year, but then of course there are some years they might decide to fly south a little ways, or in some populations more birds will fly further south than others. So it's really kind of a gap in our knowledge of how blue jays are migrating and when they decide to migrate. And certainly at my field site over just 3 years, I saw big variation in blue jay numbers there. So, you know, the first year and the third year, there are quite a lot of birds around. I was capturing a lot of young birds. However, the second year, there were very few blue jays. It was much harder to capture birds, and almost all of the birds I captured were adults and probably residents. So there's certainly some migration going on, and that's going to be a big question I'll try to address when I do all of these analyses. All right, so kind of wrapping this up, the idea, of course, as I mentioned earlier, is to see what the implications are for Appalachian forests in the future using all of this research. So I want to bring together this information on scatter hoarding behavior and blue jay population changes and see how that might impact the forest in the future. So one big area is oak management. So in particular, one of the main questions that we wanted to address from the beginning of the study was trying to see if there's a feedback loop that could contribute to even further declines of oaks. So the way this feedback loop would work is that, you know, we have declining oaks through mesification and other factors. And so that would lead to declined abundance of acorns. Now, if blue jay populations are really dependent on acorn abundance, then that could lead to reduced blue jay populations, which in turn will lead to fewer opportunities for dispersal. So there'll be fewer blue jays out there caching acorns, and so that's reduced dispersal possibilities for the oaks that are still there. So that might contribute to a feedback loop that's exacerbating this decline of oaks that hasn't been considered before. And also trying to see if we can use any of this data on blue jay populations to prioritize areas for active oak management, where you can maximize the dispersal potential for oaks. So we have all these public lands. So this figure is kind of showing a lot of public lands in southern Ohio, but there's lots of public lands across the Appalachians, and also a lot of private landowners that are interested in this. So trying to figure out, maybe help target the areas for active oak management. And then the other big area is to try and inform chestnut restoration. So again, we want to try and see if using this data on where blue jays cache, like what habitats they prefer to cache in, and where populations are greatest, can we inform the locations for founder populations when the reintroduction efforts begin to have like maximum dispersal potential of using the blue jays. And also potentially trying to improve the tree colonization models, some of which have already been developed for given the interactions between blue jays and oaks that are out there already. So this figure on the right is just showing from one paper that looked at two different scenarios of chestnut restoration, kind of showing the speed at which chestnuts will naturally disperse across the landscape. And so it's really dependent on how active or passive the restoration effort is, but we also might be able to take into account blue jay dispersal and where populations are denser. And with that, I'm going to wrap it up and acknowledge some people. So I want to acknowledge Matt Schumar and Molly McDermott, who are the private landowners that make up, or they're owning the second field site that I have in Vinton County. Bill Borovica, who's the manager of the Vinton Furnace Experimental Forest, has been super helpful. My two other committee members, Dr. Matt Davies and Dr. Libby Marshall. The College of Food, Ag, and Environmental Sciences have a seeds grant program that has funded some of this research. My field technicians over the 3 years, John Buffington, Holly Tadero, Devin Hendricks, were really crucial in collecting a lot of this data. So thank you very much for all of their hard work. And the American Chestnut Foundation has really been crucial in not only in just getting access to all those chestnut seeds, but also helping develop some of this. So Sarah Fitzsimmons, Jim McKenna, they also help fund some of this research. And some other funding agencies, the Animal Behavior Society and the Kirtland Bird Club provided grants for this research. And I want to thank the Forest Service and Division of Wildlife for their cooperation as well. All right, so I think with that, I will stop sharing and we'll get into questions.
Awesome, thank you so much, Jay. That was so interesting. I have quite a few questions myself, but we do have some questions from our attendees, which we will get to first.
Okay.
So Rick asks, is there any synchronization of blue jay populations to oak masting levels?
Well, yeah, so that's one of the big questions of the study. And I really have just begun to get all of that acorn data and all that acorn survey data together. And get all of the breeding bird survey and Christmas bird count data together. So unfortunately, I have not yet completed that analysis. So that's like one of the big questions I want to answer. So I don't have an answer to that yet.
So what I'm hearing is we're just going to have you back in another.
Yeah, maybe in a year
right?
We'll have more complete answers.
Cool. Okay, two questions from this anonymous attendee. Are wild turkey the nemesis of acorns? That's the first question.
I wouldn't call them the nemesis. I mean, I think that, so, oaks are obviously a pretty successful species. And, they've evolved these acorns primarily in conjunction with the animals that are dispersing the acorns, like squirrels and certain birds. But the fact that they provide this really great service to so many other wildlife species is not necessarily, I would say it's hard to consider any individual species a nemesis because it's, they're also part of the population. And occasionally, they might aid in some kind of dispersal and, perhaps even burial of acorns through all their kind of cooking and foraging. So acorns that fall on the trees or that fall underneath trees and they're just on the surface, if turkeys don't eat some of those and they kind of bury them in the leaves, they might be in a better condition to germinate. So no, I would say they're probably not a nemesis of oak trees.
And then the second question was, do the blue jays remember where they've cached their acorns?
Yeah, so that's one thing that has been researched a fair bit. So blue jays have pretty much any species that has developed caching behavior also needs to have a really good spatial memory. So blue jays are, they're they're a member of the smartest family of birds. So the corvid family, which includes crows and magpies and jays and nutcrackers. They're, along with parrots, kind of the smartest family of birds. And certainly blue jays have a really developed spatial memory and are able to remember the vast majority of their caches. So, blue jay survival is not really, I don't think it's really dependent on their ability to remember cache sites and like like individuals that have a bad memory. I think it's more related to things like other seed predators getting to their caches first or something like that. And so, yeah, I don't think memory is too big an issue with them. They're pretty good at remembering where their caches are.
Cool. Perry asks, has anyone researched the possibility that mycorrhizal connections between oaks coordinate synchronized masting?
That's a really great question, and something that I'm also interested in. And just the other day, I was looking to try and find research on that, and I really was not able to find much. So I think one thing that we could say is that, so the mycorrhizal networks, the main thing that has been researched and that we know that they do is they help spread out resources across an area. So, the area that mycorrhizal networks are functioning at is probably not at the same level as acorn mast synchronization. So, we're probably not getting hundreds of miles in one mycorrhizal network, but the mycorrhizal networks do help spread resources around, at least in a local forest area. So they certainly can contribute. I would say they probably contribute to those resource dynamics and kind of evening out the resources that are available to the trees. But it really hasn't been looked into too much yet into what role they might play in the really large scale synchronization.
Interesting. The next is, I think it's a comment on one of your slides. It says the total for the white oak in the dispersal results slide seems to be off by 3. I didn't notice that, but they must have been doing some quick math.
Possible. Yeah, I mean, I left out some. So those were only the ones that were taken from the platforms by blue jays, and that I was able to track down and locate. So there are a lot of nuts that were never taken from the platforms, and in particular, a lot of the white oak chestnuts that were tagged. They would take the black oaks and the chestnuts, but they maybe wouldn't take the white oak ones. So I suppose when I was summarizing, it's possible I missed a couple. But yeah, I guess that's, yeah.
So I'm going to pop in with a question, and apologies if it was already answered. My brain's a bit foggy after I had a week of sickness with my family. So can you talk a little bit more about the differences in their food preference? And I know you spent a lot of time talking about, the palatability of the different acorn groups, but just the whole black oak and how that was preferred. And I don't know if you could share just a little bit more.
Yeah, definitely.
Your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So the seed preference of blue jays has already been looked at in several studies. So I'm not the first person to do this, and my methods there were adapted from a study that was done maybe about 10 or so years ago, where they used a similar kind of selection trial platform. So there is actually quite a bit known already about seed preferences. The kind of thing that I'm adding is American chestnut and how that plays into it. But so one thing that previous studies have found is that it pretty much seems that blue jays prefer smaller acorns. So size is a big factor there. Anytime pin oaks are included in a seed selection study, pin oaks are preferred.
Yeah.
Because they're really small. So even though that's less food per acorn, it's more, they're able to transport more acorns at a time. So basically when they're transporting smaller acorns like pin oaks, they'll put in, 3, 4, 5 acorns in one, because they have that kind of gular pouch that can store some acorns a bit. And then, so they'll do one trip and have more acorns to cache. Whereas the bigger acorns like, some white oaks and certainly chestnut oak acorns, which are really big, they can only take like 1 or 2. So size is a big factor there. It's really not quite known yet if the birds are selecting based on palatability. So one thing that has been looked at more that's been found more in squirrels is that squirrels seem to actually, they'll preferentially eat white oak acorns and cache red oak acorns, because they know that red oak acorns cache better because they have that dormant period than white oak acorns. So white oak acorns, if you cache them, they put out that taproot. And so a lot of the resources and energy that are in the acorn are used up in that taproot. So if you go to eat that acorn later in the winter, there's going to be much less amount of food there. So squirrels are known to, at least in some studies, to have that behavior where they will preferentially eat white oaks rather than caching them. Blue jays, there doesn't seem to be a super strong evidence yet that they're quite as aware as squirrels are of that that issue of caching white oak acorns. But you know, I mean, I'm finding that at least between black oak and white oak acorns, they prefer black oak. But of course, the black oaks are also smaller that I'm offering them than the white oak acorn. So it's really complicated. It's hard to kind of piece out everything that's going on there. Another, just while we're talking about it, another interesting thing that squirrels do is when they are caching white oak acorns, some squirrels will actually, they'll just bite off the end of the acorn where the root is coming from, so that where the embryo is. So they essentially kill the seed before caching it, so it can't put out that taproot. Blue jays probably don't do that, but another study did find that blue jays and squirrels, when they're eating white oak acorns, or sorry, when they're eating actually either red oak or white oak acorns, they preferentially eat from the top end of the acorn, or the cap, where it is in the cap, because there are fewer tannins. The tannins are more focused down at the germination end of the acorn, and so it's actually more palatable on the cap end of the acorn. So there is some bit of how they eat the acorns. So they do have, you know, a sense of taste at least.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. I was wondering that, you know, in the one video you showed when they didn't take the white and then the blue jay's like, oh, I'll just eat it right here. So it made me think of that connection that you were talking about with squirrels, but that's interesting to hear that we don't quite know that question yet. And right now it looks like a lot of size.
Yeah, I think size is a big factor.
Yeah. All right. So Frank asks, what about hickories? Do blue jays not cache them? And then he also, well, let's just do that and then I'll ask his other questions.
Okay. Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, hickories, so I kind of didn't talk too much about hickories, but the whole like oak forest decline thing is often, it's oak hickory forest. That's like the group is oak hickory. And, but yeah, blue jays they're not really capable of caching many hickory nuts. So hickories have much thicker shells or husks around them. So it's a lot harder to get into them. So blue jays really are not caching hickories that much. They can probably still eat them maybe after they've been opened up by squirrels or something like that, or if they've been crushed on the road or something. But yeah, for the most part, they're not really caching hickories. It's too big.
Yeah. Then he goes on to ask, why would the blue jay select chestnut at all? Most would likely have never seen a chestnut.
Yeah, that's a good question too. And it's certainly something that I thought about. You know, they starting this when they first see chestnut, they've never seen that before. And so I thought it might take them a little while to start, you know, eating them or whatever. And it may have taken a little bit longer, but really, you know, blue jays are very smart and they're very curious, and they're generalists too. So, you know, they're not only eating acorns, they're eating any insects they can find throughout the winter, other, you know, seeds and stuff. So they're trying out stuff all the time. And I think that they pretty quickly were able to tell that this was something that had a food reward inside. So yeah, that was certainly a question that I had, and it seems like they're smart enough to kind of realize it pretty quickly that it's also food.
It's not like the stories of their like great grandpa and grandma telling them about these delicious chestnut acorns or out there.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting point though, that there might be some, you know, some evolutionary memory there that you know, they've evolved with these trees and they were probably responsible for dispersing them after the last ice age. So in the, you know, in the genetic makeup of blue jays, there's a familiarity with those nuts. Interesting.
And then Frank's final question is, what about beech? So asking, you know, do blue jays cache or eat them at all?
Yeah, they certainly do. So blue jays also cache beech nuts and eat them. They like them, you know, just as much as some acorns, because beech nuts are quite small as well. In my field site and this area, there's not that many mature beech that are producing a lot of nuts yet. There are some, but most of the beech are still in the understory here. So I didn't really include beech in this study, but there have been other studies that have looked at their beech dispersal, and they'll certainly cache them and eat them in the same way as they do acorns.
So there's a question here from Kathleen. She's asking a little bit about the equipment that you used and how you were able to access that equipment, expensive looking equipment, as she said.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Just kind of questions like how do you get access to this really neat research equipment?
Yeah, well, basically, you know, being in a university, especially a university like Ohio State, which has, you know, a lot of resources to draw on and a long history of wildlife research. So, you know, some of those receivers and antennas that I were using were, you know, acquired over the last, you know, 10 years or something, sometimes for other projects. But, you know, we apply for anytime we start a new research project, we apply for grant funding from different organizations to raise the funds to buy that equipment. So all of those tags, so all of the receivers and the antennas I kind of already had on hand from previous studies, but those radio tags for the birds and for the acorns are pretty expensive. So, you know, I'm having to put in grant proposals to acquire the funding to carry out the research.
Great. Paul asks, are American chestnuts generally more or less shade tolerant than oaks?
That's a good question. They are, in general, I think more shade tolerant than oaks. So they, oaks are actually not super shade intolerant. I mean, they're kind of middle of the road tolerance for shade. Chestnuts certainly grow better in canopy gaps, and they grow faster when there's more light coming in, but they're also able to survive for a really long time in a shady understory. So that's actually one of the reasons that that's been proposed of how they were able to disperse so well, even though their seeds have like almost no defenses against predation. So I neglected to mention that when I had the chestnut slide up, but I had a photo there of the Chestnut Burr. So the Chestnut Burr is really spiny, and it's very like needle-like spines on that. So that, of course, is a really good defense against predators when the acorn is developing. But as soon as the acorns are matured, those burrs just open up and they drop the chestnut, they drop the chestnut onto the ground, and then it's a free-for-all, and there's not really anything in the chestnut to prevent animals from just eating all of them. So acorns have some defense. They have a fairly thick shell for some of them. They have those tannins that make them less palatable. White oaks have the early germination. So those are all defenses against predation, whereas chestnuts don't really have any of that. So they're predated at a much higher rate. Anyhow, one of the theories as to why they were still able to be successful and disperse is that they can survive so long in the understory. So when one chestnut, as long as one chestnut kind of germinates and grows into a seedling, it can remain a seedling for decades, and it'll grow a little bit, die off, and then it puts out from the root, it puts out another shoot and grows another seedling. So it keeps doing this until the canopy gap opens up, and then it can take advantage of that light source and those resources to then grow quickly. So they have this kind of neat ability to just keep putting up shoots from one seedling root until the conditions are right to grow into a tree.
Interesting. All right, Sandra asks, are buckeyes part of the chestnut family of trees?
No, so buckeye is interesting. I grew up with horse chestnuts, which are, so yeah. So I'm from Rhode Island out east, and we just had, I think Europeans horse chestnuts on my road, and we call those chestnuts out there and collect all those chestnuts. And then I started this research and I realized, oh yeah, that's a totally different thing. So buckeyes are in the horse chestnut family. So they're sometimes called chestnuts, but they're in an entirely different family. So that the family of chestnuts it's called Fagaceae. So they're fagaceous trees. So oaks chestnuts and beech are in that family, and then buckeyes and horse chestnuts are actually in a different family.
Some confusion. There's always some confusion when using those common names, right?
And just I think that I haven't looked into it that much actually, but I don't think that blue jays really cache buckeyes that much. And buckeye nuts, a lot of them are kind of on the big side for them to cache, but I don't know. I haven't really seen that much out there of blue jays caching buckeye nuts, so I'm not sure that they do that.
Yeah. All right, Paul asks, do red oak acorns last longer when cached due to their high tannin levels?
That's a good question. And so there was a study that thought that, or that the idea was maybe by caching red oak acorns, the tannins over time deplete. And so they're more palatable later in the season. So when you return in February or something to eat a cached red oak acorn, there'll be fewer tannins, and so it'll be more palatable. And so a study looked at that and found that there doesn't actually seem to be any really significant depletion in tannins over time. So yeah, they're not. Wait, so the question, sorry, I got sidetracked. The question was.
Yeah, yes. So do the red oak acorns last longer when cached due to their high?
Yeah. So yeah, I think the tannins don't actually play that big of a role into how long they last in cached. I mean, they last longer than the white oak groups because they have a dormant period built into their genetics. That's how they germinate. Whereas white oaks just germinate right away. So they last longer than white oaks for the period of the dormancy reason, not necessarily because of the tannins.
Okay. Without fires, will maple take over the forest, and will there be less wildlife?
Well, I mean, that is kind of the general worry, is that through mesification, when the oaks die out, when the mature canopy oaks die out, in general, a lot of the trees that replace them are going to be maples. And yes, maples are not as valuable to wildlife as oaks are. Yes, they're a native species, and yes, they do provide food for larvae, but not nearly as many as oaks. And the fact that they don't produce acorns is definitely a big issue. So yes, that is one of the main worries, is that when the forests start becoming dominated by maple, there'll be less food out there for wildlife. And so you might start to see some declines, or at least some big movements away from those areas by the wildlife. Okay,
Jennifer asks if black oak acorns are more bitter and harder to get into. Is it the fat content that jays are more interested in obtaining?
Yeah, so black oak acorns, they do have a bit of a thicker shell than white oak acorns do. So they're a little bit harder to get into, but blue jays still don't have any problem getting into them. So it's like a little bit of extra work, but they do get into them fine. I can't really say for sure if it's the fat that they want. And certainly there is a food reward, and they know that. I can't really say for sure that they're really specifically trying to go for the higher fat content of black oaks. But yes, they are a little bit harder to get into, and so there are some smaller birds that would like to eat acorns, or they eat some acorns, but only the ones that they're able to penetrate with the smaller bills.
Troy asks, besides the titmice, did you notice any other significant avian competition for the acorn selections?
Yep, yeah, definitely. So the four main species that would show up were blue jays, titmice, red-bellied woodpecker, and white-breasted nuthatch. But we also, in 2 of the years, we had some red-headed woodpeckers as well. So red-headed and red-bellied woodpeckers both cache acorns. But they pretty much cache all their acorns in trees. So they're not really as great of dispersers as blue jays are. White-breasted nuthatches also cache, but they typically also cache in trees. And and then titmice cache in the ground. So those 5 species, I guess, were pretty much the ones that we had that would also take acorns. But really the vast majority were taken by blue jays and titmice.
All right, Pauline asks, are white oak acorns more poorly distributed due to preference?
Yeah, that is another really good question, and one that I've thought about because, it seems like since they germinate early, and especially some studies have shown that squirrels preferentially eat them and don't cache them, that they might not be as successful in their dispersal. And yet they seem to be fairly successful. Like their white oaks are out there in lots of places just fine. They have a pretty big range across eastern US. One thing that I've wondered is, so when I talked about the post-glacial expansion of oaks migrating north, and how it was a pretty rapid expansion, up to 300 meters per year. So one thing we don't know is which oak species were expanded that fast. So when you're looking in the pollen record, you can only tell oak pollen just as a group. So you can't tell white oak pollen from red oak from black oak pollen. So we don't know for sure which oaks, like the different speeds of how oaks were dispersed and how quickly they can disperse. So, I mean, my guess would be that the oaks that blue jays more preferred were expanded more rapidly, but looking at the fossil record, we can't tell from the pollen the difference between those oak pollens. So I don't have an answer to that. But yeah, I mean, despite the fact that they are not as preferred, they seem to be pretty successful. So it might just be that they have a longer timeline for dispersing to new areas and colonizing new places.
Yes, interesting. Fred has a very important question. What is your source of chestnuts?
Yeah, it's a secret. No, my source of chestnuts is the American Chestnut Foundation, and so I work directly with them to gather the chestnuts that I needed, and I got a special dispensation to do that. So they don't just like give chestnuts out to everybody, but they were funding some of the research, and so they really helped kind of collect chestnuts together from different orchards, so that they have a lot of different orchards. So they aren't wild chestnuts that I'm getting, because that almost doesn't exist anymore. So yeah, the Chestnut Foundation helped me get together a lot of stuff.
Excellent. Kathleen has a fun question. She's asking if any of the adult blue jays brought any young to your stations that you had cameras on.
Oh, it's probably. So at that time in the fall, it's very difficult to tell the difference between adults and young birds on camera. When I capture them in hand, you can tell the age of the birds from subtle differences in the feathers. But by that point in September and October, the young are pretty much fully grown. And so they look very similar to adults. But blue jays do generally kind of stay in family groups or loose family groups for a while. Sometimes the young might migrate, sometimes they might hang around the adults for longer. But I don't really have any way of knowing for sure if like parents brought a chick or one of their own young to the platform.
The next question is from Jennifer. I think we already kind of touched on this when we had that discussion about tannins, but just in case, are cached acorns less bitter over the winter?
Are cached less bitter over what?
Cached acorns less bitter over winter.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so I guess kind of like I said before, they don't seem to get any less bitter as the winter goes on. At least from the one study that looked at that, didn't seem to find any reduction in tannins.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've read that as the seed gets closer to germination, the tannin content lessens. So you'd think that it would over winter get more palatable, but
yeah, maybe it's, I don't know. I of course haven't studied that, and I'm not a like tree biologist or anything, but it might be that the tannins, it's a much faster process of when the tannin reduction begins. And
Yeah,
I have to look at the study in detail to see exactly how they looked at that. Maybe they didn't go as far through the winter or something.
Through the
to
winter,
when the
right?
start to deplete.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm going to look into it now. My mind's wondering as well. So Franz had to leave, but he said, thank you. This was a fascinating presentation and very impressive research.
Thank you.
And yeah, and then Mark has a question. Did you find any blue jays caching acorns and or chestnuts in old fields close to seed source oaks? And then he says, secondly, any caching in old fields further away from acorn/chestnut source?
Yeah, so my field site is pretty much a contiguous Appalachian forest, but there are areas of like young, so early successional or kind of newer clear-cut areas. So there's not necessarily any old field areas at my field site, but there are different ages of forest. And in particular, there's one of my platforms was located on the edge of a clear cut that was, what year was that? I can't remember, maybe it was 2010 or 2014. So it's getting to the point where it has some small trees and a lot of blackberry brambles and stuff. It's really kind of dense with low vegetation like that. And they did really prefer to cache in that area. So often they seem to prefer to cache along edges of the forest or actually in the younger forest where there's more cover low to the ground. So that's one. I haven't done the formal analysis, but just anecdotally from like looking at where birds were caching nuts, they definitely seem to prefer to not cache in just an open understory forest and cache in more early successional and edge type habitat.
Interesting. All right. Jennifer asks, will you be involved in developing a program to plant more oaks in Southern Ohio based on this research?
Maybe. I mean, I don't know of a program yet that I would be involved with, but I certainly want my research to help kind of inform oak management as much as possible. And so I'll certainly try my best to be in touch with people that are making those decisions and doing those plantings.
Yeah. So Denise has a fun biology question. Do birds have taste buds?
Yeah, that's a good question. A lot of birds don't have a great sense of smell, and they have like almost no sense of smell. Turkey vultures are kind of famously ones that do have a really great sense of smell. They're able to locate, rotting carcasses. I think that there's, I think a lot of birds have a very limited sense of taste. Actually, I can't remember. It's been a while since I really looked at the actual data on like the physiology of their taste, but I know they don't have a very subtle palate like we do. It's probably pretty basic taste buds.
Okay, a few more questions here. Frank asks, your blue jays preferred chestnuts. However, chestnuts dispersed much slower than oak. Why wouldn't jays have dispersed them better than oaks after the ice retreated?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and he noticed on that. So that figure that I showed when I was talking about the dispersal, I didn't really explain it, but really it had the dispersal rates for oaks on top, and then beech, and then chestnut. And chestnut was a much slower dispersal than the oak genus pollen. And so I think the reason for that is kind of what I touched on before, is that even though they may like to disperse chestnuts, they're so preferred by wildlife because they're so palatable, they're easy to get into, that even when they cache them, and so maybe birds don't have a great sense of smell or taste, but rodents do, and certainly the rodents, as soon as they come across chestnuts, they're going to eat those things. So a lot more of the chestnuts are eaten by seed predators, and even the cached ones are probably very few of those caches escape predation. So I'm thinking that that's one of the reasons that they have much slower dispersal than oak, because the seed predation rate is just so much higher.
All right. Our last question, Fred asks, are caches used only one season or annually?
Yeah, so for blue jays, so since they're doing that scatter hoarding and they're caching in you know, hundreds of different areas every year, they probably don't necessarily have actual like individual cache spots that they're using every year, but they do have territories. So a lot of, especially the adults, if they're not migrating, if they decide to stay near where they bred, then a lot of times they will cache in their breeding territory area. So they may wander a little bit outside of their breeding area over the course of the winter, but studies have found that they do prefer to cache near their breeding territory. So they're certainly going to use the same areas. I don't know that they would really kind of specifically go back to the exact kind of square centimeters of where their caches are, because there's so many so spread out. But you know, squirrels probably do, and things that are making burrows like that.
Great. Well, Jay, again, thanks everybody. There's already been some great thank you comments. There's another comment. Oh, what? We just got another question.
Okay.
I have an 80-year-old red oak in the backyard with a family of blue jays living in and around this tree. I have photos of jays stowing away seeds and nuts in gutters. So more of a comment, but kind of noticing that.
How old was the oak?
80-year-olds or 80
Oh,
years.
80-year-old. Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not 8, sorry.
Yeah, that's cool. I mean, they don't only cache in the ground. They certainly will cache other places as well, especially in an urban environment. But kind of find wherever they can. And one thing that I didn't mention is that, you know, there's a lot of genetic variation in the trees as well. So, you know, some people might have noticed that, you know, you talk about these masting cycles and these changes in acorn abundance, but some people have trees that just produce a ton of acorns every year. And that happens. And that's just genetic variation. So some trees are just, you know, they call them super producers, where they're pretty much, as long as the conditions are okay, they're just going to go crazy every year. So maybe they have some kind of hormone imbalance, but yeah, so there's a lot of variation in that as well.
Cool. Well, Jay, thanks again so much. Really, really cool stuff. Everybody, you're already given thanks in the chat, but go ahead and do that if you haven't already. Tell Jay how much you appreciated his talk. I'm going to stop the recording. Kathy's going to